Welcome to the Church of Love, a podcast hosted by myself, Jyoti, along with co-hosts Swamini, Shraddhananda, Saraswati, and Reverend Rachel Schwab. The show is produced by Freedom Media, LLC. Church of Love will explore the changing dynamic of spirituality worldwide and the common belief that God is, in whatever shape he, she, it takes, the essence of love. We hope to remind you that you are love and are loved. So sit back, relax, and join us at the Church of Love.
This week on Church of Love, we are joined by Rabbi David Wolpe to discuss faith and meaning in difficult times. Together, we will explore how faith and connection to our spiritual community can support us during life's most challenging moments. Named one of the 500 most influential people in Los Angeles in 2016 and again in 2017, most influential rabbi in America by Newsweek, and one of the 50 most influential Jews in the world by the Jerusalem Post, David Wolpe is the Max Webb Senior Rabbi of Sinai Temple. Rabbi Wolpe previously taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America in New York, the American Jewish University of Los Angeles, Hunter College, and UCLA. A columnist for Time.com, he has been published and profiled in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post's On Faith website, the Huffington Post, and the New York Jewish Week. Rabbi Wolpe is the author of 8 books, including the national bestseller, Making Loss Matter, Creating Meaning in Difficult Times. His new book is titled David, the Divided Heart. Today, we are pleased to welcome to the show Rabbi Wolpe.
I'm so actually excited to have him join our show today. I think that he's just going to offer so much to the conversation, we've been having over the past few weeks about how people are able to identify with this this being of love, that in some religions we call God, and talk about how we can really connect with our faith and each other during difficult times in our life.
Faith is such an important topic right now, especially with the isolation that we are facing. And I've been doing some pretty interesting reading lately that talks about, the burden that isolation puts on our faithfulness. And then also just kind of addressing where people are who don't have a strong faith base. How do they enter into this arena where there's so much grief and so much suffering? What is it that they're relying on? And so there's some pretty interesting work that's being done in this sector, and I'm really intrigued and interested to hear what Rabbi Wolpe has to contribute to that conversation.
Wonderful, and he's joining us right now.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah. Welcome, Rabbi. Welcome.
Hi there.
We're so glad you're
Thank
here.
you. I am so glad to be here. Even the simplest technical directions befuddle me. So forgive me. I was trying to connect earlier, but it worked. So I'm glad.
Thank you. Yeah, we were talking actually via email, Rabbi Wolpe. This is Jyoti, about how, now, especially in this age of coronavirus where everyone is doing things, remotely from their homes a lot. It's been, it's been very, very interesting and a challenge. And so me personally, I have 3 dogs here and a cat. And so I was just in my other room where I've been doing like my podcast and my show, and the internet started to not reach over there. And my husband I had to switch rooms. So he's trying to get all 3 dogs and go to another part of our house. And so, thank you so much for being here tonight.
I'm a little bit convinced that the same gremlin that always steals one sock from my dryer keeps turning off my computer at crucial times.
Right, exactly.
Anyway, it's a pleasure to talk to you.
Yes,
and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. We're incredibly humbled to have you on the show. You are known to offer so much guidance and inspire faith in the Jewish community. And I believe that your leadership inspires so many people around the world. I just was even this weekend watching a video of you and Sadhguru from India. So like you have a wide reach around the world of people that just really are drawn to you. And on this show, one of the questions that we are exploring is can and how do we have a direct relationship with God? Even in the best circumstances, this is challenging. Yeah. So what are your reflections on how people can develop their relationship with God during the best and the most challenging times?
Well, I mean, it's a large question, and I'll start with two observations. One is that in some ways it is easier to develop a relationship when things are difficult, because difficulty opens the heart in a way that ease doesn't. And so there are parts of all of us, I think, that are more accessible in times that are hard than they are accessible in times that are easy. There's a saying in the Talmud that the eye has a light part and a dark part, but you can only see through the dark part. And that idea that in the darkness there are things available to us that the light doesn't afford is, I think, an idea that's common to all spiritual traditions. And also, I think there have been a lot of great spiritual leaders who've struggled with darkness and depression. And part of what they've done that has been so powerful is to bring from that darkness, to wrest from it, their insights. So the first thing I would say is, we should not assume that it is harder. It's different, but it's not necessarily harder to develop a relationship in darkness. And the second thing that I think is really important for people to keep in mind is that this right now is not a pause in life. It's a preparation for when it's over. And so if you think about this as the chance to do work on yourself, on your relationships and so on, so that you'll be the person you want to be when this is over, you can look at it differently. Not everything is being stopped, but certain things are being allowed. I mean, this conversation never would have happened were it not for the virus. At least certainly wouldn't have happened now and in this way. And then the last, I guess, 3 points. I said two, but I'll make one more quick one, which is I'm a crusader against the idea that whatever God is here to do us favors. And if we pray to make things right, I think your question was exactly right. It's not about the goods you get. It's about the relationship you develop. And if you think about that, as opposed to God must be distant because bad things are happening, but rather God is not there to serve my wants and needs, but to draw close to. You'll think about it differently, and I'll give you one image, and then I promise I'll stop, which is there was a medieval Jewish preacher who said, imagine that you were standing on the shore of a lake, and you saw a man pulling a boat. He's in the boat, and he's pulling the boat to the shore. He said, if you didn't understand mechanics and motion, you might think he was pulling the shore to the boat. And that's the mistake that a lot of people make when they pray. They think what they're doing is they're adjusting God to their wants. But in fact, if you pray properly, what you do is you adjust yourself to God. And if we think of it that way, it opens doors.
Absolutely beautifully stated, Rabbi. Thank you so much for that. This is Swamini Shraddhananda, and what you're saying is just drawing so many different thoughts in my mind right now. But one thing based on the concept of relationship with God is I'm called to remember in a counseling coaching book that I was studying at one point, where it said, it's never you and your partner versing each other. It's always you and whoever your partner is, your spouse, your child, facing the problem together. And so what I'm hearing is that, that perhaps I don't want to speak for you, but perhaps you would agree that it's not you versus God, that
Right.
it's you depending upon the faith that you have in God in order for that faith and yourself to face whatever challenge it is that's right in front of you.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, whatever, and I think that we share one thing that we share. I gather from your introduction is I am agnostic about what God is. By agnostic, I mean I don't understand it. I always tell the students in our school, like if they're, let's say they're 12 years old, I say to them, could you, when you were two, could you understand what it is to be a 12-year-old? And they say, no, a 2-year-old not only doesn't know what a 12-year-old is, the 2-year-old doesn't know what they don't know about it being a 12-year-old. I said, so God, in relation to us, whatever God is far greater in distance from than a 12-year-old to a 2-year-old. So everybody who tells you God is this or God is that, or obviously God wants this or that, is speaking without being able to fully comprehend. The best we can do is exactly what you said, which is try to live in some kind of harmony with what it is that we understand of God in this world. And that is, just as you said, a sort of alliance, not adversarial, but you use God's inspiration and forward movement and sort of wind beneath you to move in the direction that you think is good and is best.
Absolutely. And it seems like right now in the world that there's a lot of grief, that's happening,
Yes.
and that there's a lot of confusion around the relationship between grief and faith. And I've heard it said in the past, and it's written, those who believe need not grieve, which also implies the reverse to be true, that those who grieve do not believe. But everyone experiences grief and faith a little bit differently. So what would you say to the idea that experiencing grief does not necessarily indicate a loss of faith? And then also following up on that, when a person is in such a deep state of grief, but they don't already have faith, how would you suggest that they get some?
So, yeah, exactly. So, in answer to the first question, yes, I don't think that having faith doesn't make you human. And people of faith, I mean, even our greatest exemplars of faith go through all the different phases that other human beings do. And I actually think that the first question in some ways leads to the second, which is the issue is not so much whether you have grief or pain, it's whether you have meaning. What we want from life is not that it be painless, but that that the pain serves some purpose. And to lose faith is largely to lose meaning. And what I would say is that if you can recover the sense that the world has purpose and meaning, that's the path to faith. If you think this is just a large random pageant where terrible things happen and it doesn't mean anything, that's a very, very hard way to live. And I also think it's not true. But if you can understand that, okay, if you can look at, for example, the people who are healthcare workers, who are taking their lives into their hands to cure people, you can look at that one of two ways. You can say they're idiots, or you can say they obviously understand that life is about more than just what makes them, just what satisfies their needs. In other words, life has meaning beyond them. And if you believe that, and you believe that life has meaning beyond you, then again, what it is that you believe that meaning is, that's a different question. I think the great divide, and this may or may not help your listeners, but I hope it does. I think the great divide is not between the religious and non-religious. The great divide is between the materialists and those who believe that the world is composed of more than stuff,
Yeah.
that spirit in some sense is real. However you then think of that spirit, that's already the second question. But if you believe that that we're more than just synapses, that somehow we have souls, or there is soul, or soul exists really in the world, that already is on your way to meaning. And it may be that the way that spirit manifests itself in our time is disappointing or painful to you, but But if you believe that there is something more than just you, that there's something higher than you, and that your life is best lived in service of more than just your wants, then you're mostly there.
Yeah.
What a wonderful answer.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for that. This is Reverend Rachel Schwab, and I'm just very grateful for your response. And I can't imagine, I can't imagine as a spiritual leader of a congregation. I understand how challenging it is to provide that meeting or provide ways of helping people reach that meaning. And
Right.
I recently was looking through your book, Making Loss Matter, and it's actually one of my favorites, as I do work a lot, of course, with folks that are grieving and going through the dying process and things like that. And then now with us being in quarantine, we're dealing with a different level of
Right.
grief, as you have talked about, and so this whole idea of focusing on the meaning just reminds me of the part in your book where you talk about the power of story and telling our story, as well as the story of our traditions, if we are part of a tradition.
Right.
What stories, perhaps, for our listeners, do you draw strength from, whether they be personal
Yeah.
or faithful, and how are you assisting your congregation and those you serve during this time?
So thank you for that question.
Yes.
First of all, I've been sending out every day for the last couple of weeks, 1 minute. One of the ways that I serve people is by not going on for too long, because I know that everybody's patience is exhausted
Agreed.
by everyone's sending them a billion different articles. And
I totally feel what you're saying. Yeah.
You have to see this. You have to read this. And
Right.
and I suspect, by the way, that people send on articles that they themselves haven't read, but that's a
Right.
separate.
Correct.
So,
Gotcha.
so I have been sending out a daily inspiration that really is about 60 seconds every day. And let me tell you one story that I told on one of the daily inspirations a couple days ago. It's an ancient rabbinic story about a guy who's sitting on the side of the road, and he sees two people, and each of them is carrying a very heavy stone. And he says to one of them, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm carrying a heavy stone." And he said to the other, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm building the Temple of Solomon." And the point is that how you see your task changes your task.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're someone who's alone, for example, and you know that there's someone else who's going nuts because they have 3 little kids at home, if you can talk to them and be a listening ear, then your solitude serves a purpose, which is you have the quiet around you to be able to listen to someone else. And if you're in reverse, if you're somebody who, the comedian Martin Mull once said, having kids is like having a bowling alley installed in your brain. So
That's great.
So if you're one of the people with a bowling alley in your brain, then you can offload some of that noise to the people who have too much quiet around them. It all depends on how you see what you're going through, and if you see it again as having some purpose and meaning. And as you said, if your story is something that you can shape and tell. So part of my story is that I, like you, I have what I think of as the good fortune to have to create meaning from this experience so that I can share it.
Yeah.
And that's a great thing, because otherwise it would just happen. But I have to think about it, and I have to try to make it mean something so that I can share that meaning with others. And I think of that as a blessing.
Yes. I mean, and it's almost like I have found sort of those rituals of doing, say, a daily devotional. I do a weekly word for Wednesday.
Mm-hmm.
So some of these things are for ourselves as spiritual leaders, or guiding groups that are dealing with this time,
Yes.
It's almost part of my own self-care, I have found as a spiritual leader. Have you found that as well? I mean, just describing that, it's like you're sort of forced to say, okay, I have to address this. It's almost like saying I have to address my own grief,
Yes.
really, so that I can help others. I mean, just like with anything we do.
One of my
Yeah.
teachers, when I was in school to study to be a rabbi, said, your best sermons are always addressed to yourself.
Yes.
And he was absolutely right. Any sermon that I need to hear, I discover magically people say, that one was really good.
Right.
And I said, yeah,
Exactly.
that's right, because I
So
was
true.
talking to me.
Right.
And so for me, part of the challenge which isn't true for everyone, but for me, part of the challenge of this is I am something of a loner anyway. So I sort of see this as, in some ways, a chance to read all the books I want to read and to catch up watching all the things I want to watch. And I have to remember that, there are people to call and check in with and so on. And I'm not allowed to be that self-indulgent, which is my natural inclination. So, and also the other gift of this, and I'm sure that I live with my 23-year-old daughter. So she walked into the kitchen the other day and saw me steaming vegetables, which I must admit is a sight she has never seen in her life. and she said, and she looked and she goes, I love Apocalypse Dad.
That's
and
perfect.
I thought, we're doing things that we normally wouldn't do. And
Never do. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, totally. Oh, yeah.
So beautiful.
I have to say that I was very, there's so many beautiful nuggets that you're sharing with us tonight. And one of them that I wrote down was earlier on, you said, difficulty opens the heart the way ease doesn't. And so, I wrote that down. I'm chuckling to myself a little bit because every year my husband and I walk a portion of this one pilgrimage called the Camino de Santiago in Spain.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And so it's very physically challenging, it's mentally challenging, it's emotionally challenging, and you are walking alone, even if you're walking with, someone in many ways, because you're dealing with all the things about your knee hurts, your back hurts, you're carrying a backpack, you're going uphill, and then, and you're just uncovering all these things in your mind. And so I was saying to my husband something about it being challenging. He's like, well, I think that if it wasn't challenging, no one would appreciate it as much, So, and I'm like, well, there could be joy in the ease of it. But as we're talking about these stories and about reaching out, one of the things that I have found to be very apparent before, the coronavirus is the level of isolation that we all have had from each other. Our communities are very different than they were even 60 years ago. And we had already started to have not fully authentic relationships, very virtual connections. We lost so much of the personal connection. And, now for many people across the country and globally, we're increasingly isolated. So, how do we go about building spiritual community and grow in our spiritual path by serving others in a virtual environment?
So, first of all, I know that I have thought, and I have a friend who has always wanted to take that. I can't believe you do that every year. Wow.
Not the whole
remarkable.
Thing. Parts of it.
Still. That's really, that's just like my niece is married to the guy who was for a while the marketing director of Burning Man. And he said to me, when are you coming to Burning Man? And I said, literally when hell freezes over. So I admire, but I one day maybe. So I think that you're right. We really wonder how people will come back together after this separation. What will it be like? How will churches and synagogues and mosques and other houses of worship open? And will people be willing to gather together the way they were? And how long will it take before communities feel comfortable being close to one another again? I think that that's one of the things that we're all struggling with and we all wonder about. And I don't know if we know the answer to that yet. And in the meantime, we're trying to create these virtual communities by streaming all of our services and by teaching classes with Zoom and so on. And I find it's magical that we can do it, but it's also disorienting. It's not, there is nothing like actual physical presence. And it's one of the remarkable things that actually came to light was someone read a history of my synagogue, which is now about 115 years old. And they found in the archives that in 1918, for 2 months, there were no gatherings and no services because of the flu pandemic. And then they said, and after it was over, everyone came rushing back. So I'm hopeful that that's what will happen eventually here, depending obviously on all the medical questions, because it's really tough to create communities that are genuine communities through screens and keyboards. And I do worry about it. For all, I am grateful to the wizards who have brought us the technology that allows us to connect as much as we can.
Well, that's pretty amazing. And what just came to my mind, several things. My mind works that way. But it sounds to me like, in some ways, perhaps this pandemic is actually the antidote to the exodus that we see occurring in the larger organizations of religion. That maybe people will become or experience this isolation and then long in their hearts for that connection, which you said, and correct me if I got this wrong, but there's nothing like physical presence. And so the heart longs
you're
for
exactly
that.
right.
Yeah, and so maybe this is the antidote to the exodus, and if it's not the antidote to the exodus, then maybe it is the antidote to just the tendency to feel like there's a need to walk away at all.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that this will remind people how deep is the human desire to be with others. I think that that's true. I don't know, because we've never seen this before, whether it will have lasting effects on the psyche of the way we move about in society. One of the things that for many years, I have been very, very impressed with is how bad we are at predicting the future. We really, people make predictions all the time, and we're really terrible at it. And I have, by the way, as I'm sure you do, parishioners, congregants who ask me all the time what's going to happen, not only about the coronavirus, but about other things. I always tell them, I'll tell you what's going to happen, but chances are I'll be wrong. I mean, I'm happy to give you my best opinion, but I don't know. And it's amazing how often we're wrong about things, but it doesn't dampen our certainty that we'll be right next time. So all of a sudden, everybody's an epidemiologist. You know, we all know.
We forget very quickly.
Well, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm hopeful that the human hunger, both for each other and for something beyond ourselves, will be at least a little bit reawakened by this time.
That's amazing, and the philosopher Martin Buber, his words also, all real living is meeting. It's all this context of meeting. And so then the absence of real meeting means the absence of life in some way. And I'm inspired because I see that, go ahead. What were you going to say, Rabbi?
No, please go. Finish. Okay. You're inspired because you see.
I'm inspired because I see that some of the larger organizations, most of them, they are acknowledging faith in isolation. The Chabad.org has a great article online right now that states, there's a quote I pulled from there: the distance at which the individual stands from an easy, immediate, and innocent identification with nation, society, and physical environment, as well as other people, is a distinguishing mark of the age, and one which has its obvious spiritual reflection. For the relationship between man and God is not independent of that between man and the world. Together with a separation of man from God, and the world goes in estrangement of the man from himself. And I just think that that's such a powerful statement.
Very,
and
very
then the other
powerful.
one was the Catholic Church also, and they have a page dedicated to this faith in isolation. And so do you feel that the acknowledgement of the impact of isolation, the relationship of faith to grief and faith to isolation, do you feel that what we're doing virtually is enough to carry us over to the next moment?
So it is a deep question, and deserves perhaps a deeper answer than I can give. But the best I can do is to say that I think that it's true that faith. I've never met a human being in general. Everybody is tied to a specific land, language, family, origin, memories, so on, and that the specifics of your connection are really part of your connection. And when you pluck up the specifics, and everybody is on Zoom from all these different places, but essentially they're the same, it's true that it makes a distance because there is no specificity, there is no grounding to who you are and where you are. And when you ask, is that enough to get us through this moment? My answer is it has to be, because we have nothing else. And as long as we have nothing else, that's what we're going to have to do our best with. But the fact that the author of the article and you keep reminding us that that's not enough is really important, because we tend, as you know, as we're adjustable creatures, and we tend to get used to what we are used to. And we need people to say, don't get used to this. It's not actually what you need most deeply. And so maybe, don't keep getting used to eating food that isn't ultimately nourishing or deeply nourishing, because sooner or later you'll pay a price. And I think that that's probably part of our task, is to keep saying it's great that we have this virtual community, but please remember it's not the community we need.
That's amazing. And thank you for your patience letting me get all that thought out.
I thought it was great. I was
It was
not
a big one.
No, I thought it was wonderful.
Oh, I loved your response though, and absolutely, yes, I'm 100% in line with what you're offering and sharing. So thank you so much for contributing that answer.
Thank you.
Wow. This is Reverend Rachel again. I have been just in awe of what you have to say, and hope that these words and thoughts can be continue to flourish and flow through to our congregations and beyond. And I just, one thing that's really been on my mind a lot recently is how people are, if they are in fact drawn closer to, I think as you mentioned in the beginning, just about moving into this different, not necessarily different time, but just another part of life. And I think that some traditions, I think some people think, I've seen it more in my tradition where people want to just have the nice, happy sermon, like we're just going to talk about the good things. And I guess one question that has come out of all this is we can really learn from those other faith people that have come from faith traditions in which there has been a lot of suffering. And I think about the Jewish history and what we learn from that, and really helping people to see that everything we are in right now, we still are in a holy ground, even if we're in our own homes. And so how, or what are the stories that you would say that best, from your tradition, that best kind of lift this up, that help us to understand what it is to suffer, and kind of and the whole idea of lament. I did a whole thing on lament, and that's something that we're just not comfortable doing. A lot of us, we're not comfortable with lamenting. And so we
Right.
lean on other traditions and other people's stories. So how do you express that?
So I could take this in lots of directions. I'll start by saying that, first of all, a book that every human being should read is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. It's a book that came out of his experience in the concentration camps. It's a short book, and there he explains not only that, explains in a deeper way than I've ever seen it, how while you cannot control what happens to you, you do have control over how you react to what happens to you. And it's filled with fascinating observations, like the observation that, maybe old people envy the young, but one advantage that old people have is that no one can take away the experiences and achievements that they already have. And they forget the anxiety of the young about whether they will be able to have those achievements and do those things. And by the way, at a time like this, tremendous anxiety about that among younger people for the world that they will have, and understandably so. And so I will give you two examples of what I talked about recently to my congregation. One was the reality that this is brought home to us that we tend to deny, which is that people die. And whatever you believe about what happens to you after death, we have so removed death from our everyday experience. Whereas for most of human history, death was an ever-present reality. People died in the streets. You couldn't avoid it. And we live our lives as though we are immortal. I mean, this is my argument sometimes about what's wrong. I grew up on the East Coast. And I always say that what's wrong with Los Angeles is it has no autumn. It has no fall. So it's supposed to be spring, 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 and then you die, right? Because the beauty of aging, which is what autumn is all about, doesn't exist here as much. And while that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, this has brought home to us the reality that death is an everyday accompaniment of life. And that's not a bad thing for us to know and to keep in mind. And we have to be more comfortable with talking about it because it is a reality. And the second part of this, which is a more practical thing, which I will encourage, I just spoke about it this past Shabbat, this past Sabbath, is that you have to let the people around you whom you love know what you want, both medically and also what you want with the disposition of whatever you have. Because as a rabbi over the years, I have seen horrible pain inflicted on children and grandchildren from people who didn't make arrangements before they died. And while this does not sound like a spiritual thing, it actually is profoundly spiritual to care enough and love enough that you face your own mortality and say, I know I'm going to die one day, and I don't want to leave these people who I'm going to leave behind having to make awful medical decisions on my behalf without being able to ask me, or having to distribute all my property without knowing what I want. And so I'm going to love them enough to make the arrangements to learn that, as you say, confronting suffering and death can help you also treat the people in your life more lovingly and take care of them better. In terms of the stories, we just finished Passover. And Passover is the story of slavery to freedom and darkness to light. And that is, I think, the hope and the expectation and the narrative of virtually every spiritual tradition. Is not, there's everything from the music, everything from the spiritual hymns to the stories of the Buddha wandering, of Jesus on a cross, of Muhammad in a journey, of Moses leading the Israelites across the desert. It is all about that you don't get any promised land without pain, that nobody moves through this world unscathed, and no one should expect to. And the people who are successes are not the people who manage to avoid difficulty. They're the people who march through difficulty and believe that on the other side there's something rich and meaningful and beautiful.
Yes. Oh, yes. What a wonderful reply. This is Swamini again. I love what I'm hearing. I really I identify very much with what you're saying, and particularly the concept of death and how we're not overly comfortable with this topic in the United States. Oftentimes we draw a comparison between the United States and India, where in India they talk about death all the time and they won't talk about
Yes.
sex. And here in the States we talk about sex all the time, but we won't talk about death. You know? So
That's
it's
very
kind
funny.
of, yeah, it's kind of an interesting extreme. But what I see in death is that embracing the actuality and the inevitability of it allows us in some interesting faith-based, psychological way, spiritual way, to better address each other's needs during time like this. And in our society right now, one of the things is that I see is coming forward so powerful is the chasm that exists between people who feel that there's an actual pandemic and people who don't. And
Right.
the people who feel there is, they seem to be embracing this concept of, death is always right around the corner. We
Right.
never know when Yama, the Lord of Death, is going to knock on the door, so to speak. Whereas other individuals who are not looking at this pandemic with such serious eyes might be missing an opportunity to better serve the needs of others and to better come into a place of compassion and empathy. What would you say to that?
So I agree with every word you said, and I would add the sad dimension that I think you would feel the same way, that that your judgment of the science and the statistics has become a political as opposed to an informational question. And like almost all the questions of our society, all of a sudden people decide what they think about things based on where they stand on the political spectrum, which is a shame. And all I can say is I'm not going to dissuade anyone. I have long since learned that from their view of something as fundamental as whether this is a pandemic and whether they're right or left on the podcast. The only thing I will say is it is actually, I think, my job, rather than to persuade people who disagree with me, to understand why people who disagree with me feel the way they do.
Agreed.
Because if all of us are spending our time saying, no, you don't understand, this is how it is, we'll never make any progress. But if instead we say, maybe I don't understand you, explain better why you believe what you do, we might actually make some progress. And the second is much harder to do than the first, but it is the only thing that will expand me. I won't expand at all if I tell you all the reasons why I'm right. I know I've done it a lot, so believe me, I know it won't expand me even the tiniest bit. But I really do generally learn something if I hold my judgment in abeyance long enough to understand why somebody else disagrees with me.
Absolutely. That's one of the biggest lessons that I learned when I was in pre-law. Was that you need to look at all sides without judging them. You need to just really be able to understand with some degree of equanimity.
Right.
Otherwise, you'll never understand your own. Yeah.
It's just very hard to do. So.
Any final thoughts or ideas that you would like to share with us, Rabbi? And again, just feeling so much gratitude for this conversation.
Thank you. I really do appreciate that. I think the only other thing that I would say is that this will be over in one way or another, and we will look back and think of things we could or couldn't have done. And it's always good, if you can, to try to look back before you have to and say, okay, if I knew like a year from now that I was going to have a month or 2 months of being in my home, what would I have wanted to do? If this had happened a year ago, what would I have wanted to do? And And I hope that at least part of it is what I would have wanted to do is to spend some of that time solidifying my relationships and deepening my faith. And then do it, because this will be over. And this time, I think re-entry will be harder than people assume. Everybody thinks they're going to just want to rush out of their houses, but I think there'll be some nostalgia for the time when we actually had to be home, and we actually had to contend with, the people in our home for good and for bad. So try now to do what it is that later you'll wish you had done.
Rabbi Wolpe, thank you so much for the many gifts you gave us this evening. We have so much gratitude for you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very grateful for the opportunity. Take care.
To learn more about Rabbi Wolpe or for his online programs, visit SinaiTemple.org, and you can also find his new book, David, the Divided Heart, on Amazon.
What an amazing conversation to be part of. Rabbi Wolpe brought such dynamic discussion to our table. I can only imagine how the listeners must feel. Can you sense the change that's happening? The shift in spirituality, religion, society? Has today's program inspired you to be just a little more aware about where you intend to bring your practice, if in fact you are looking for a new church or an alternate teaching? Or perhaps today's show has illustrated the powerfulness and the symbology of the current movement of people looking for a sacred space where they belong. It is helpful to remember spirituality is a journey, and that journey is a little bit different for each of us. Let's not judge the journey of others. Instead, we can hold the highest intention of understanding, empathy, and unity, no matter the labels we apply. Thank you for joining us on the Church of Love. Remember, you are love, and you are loved. Be well, everyone.